Welcome to Dialogue. This is the Deep Dive, and we are continuing our ongoing series looking at these really documented real-world examples of dirty politics. We're trying to understand how these complex, sometimes really covert operations actually work and, what they leave behind, the precedents they set. Today, we are opening up Case 11. This one focuses on the, extraordinary and really unprecedented actions of a local law enforcement agency, the New York Police Department's Intelligence Division. We're going to be examining their widespread, systematic surveillance of Muslim communities all across the Northeast, an operation that ran, and this is key, ran intensively from 2002 all the way to 2014.
And our mission today is very, very specific. We want to unpack a particular form of political control because this surveillance, it moved entirely beyond the established rules of, traditional policing. It wasn't based on probable cause. It wasn't based on reasonable suspicion against a specific person. No, instead we are looking at a system that was built not primarily to capture terrorists, but to regulate the daily behavior of an entire demographic group.
That distinction right there, law enforcement versus behavior regulation, that is everything. That's the core of what we're talking about today. The central thesis of this case is, it's frankly chilling. The stated reason was always counterterrorism. That was the cover. But the real political lesson here, what this reveals, is what happens when the state decides that your identity itself is enough evidence for suspicion.
Identity becomes the lead.
Yes. The intelligence apparatus completely replaced the need for actual criminal leads with the simple fact of, who you are. And it traded traditional deterrence for the psychological pressure of just permanent, pervasive visibility.
And that pivot you just described, that's the heart of it. That's where an entire group of citizens stops being seen as individuals with rights and starts being viewed as a population to be managed. And that right there is how dirty politics adapts and weaponizes a crisis. So we really need to understand how the architecture for that system was built.
Okay, so to understand how the NYPD even got to this point, we have to start with the context of 9/11. It's impossible to separate this from that. After September 11, 2001, the rules for intelligence gathering in the U.S. just changed dramatically. Some of it was very public, the Patriot Act and things like that. But a lot of the really critical foundational changes happened quietly, inside institutions. And none were more dramatic than what happened inside municipal police forces.
The entity involved here is so important. We are not talking about the CIA or the FBI, agencies that you would expect to be doing large-scale intelligence. We are talking about the New York Police Department, a city police force.
A city police force.
And yet, in the aftermath of the attacks, the NYPD just exponentially expanded its intelligence operations. They created a capability that genuinely rivaled federal agencies, and it extended way beyond New York's borders.
And this expansion, it basically allowed them to operate under a completely new set of rules, or I guess more accurately, without the usual rules. They started gathering intelligence on U.S. citizens without any of the standard requirements. No warrants, no need to show probable cause that a crime was happening or was about to happen.
And just to appreciate the scale of this rule bending, we have to remember the history of policing in New York City. Since the 1980s, the NYPD had been operating under something called the Henshaw Settlement, and that placed very clear restrictions on politically motivated surveillance, precisely because of earlier abuses like COINTELPRO.
Right.
The post-9/11 environment essentially gave the department a green light to bypass all of those constitutional and legal guardrails. All they had to do is reclassify everything as intelligence gathering.
Okay, so let's unpack the creation of this thing. This wasn't just a few new task forces. In 2002, the NYPD Intelligence Division set up a covert subdivision. Internally, they called it the Demographics Unit. And its mission was explicitly not about solving past crimes. It was for what they called preemptive mapping and behavioral forecasting.
And their mandate, which was later revealed in their own internal reports, was shockingly explicit. It was a 3-part directive. Identify, map, and monitor.
Identify, map, and monitor.
And the target was defined in the absolute broadest terms possible, entire Muslim communities. And it was regardless of any evidence of specific criminal activity by anyone, literally anyone, within those communities.
So this meant transforming ordinary locations, the very fabric of civic and religious life, into targets for surveillance.
Yeah.
And purely based on who used them.
Precisely. The reports that detail this operation give us specific, sometimes incredibly mundane, examples of the locations they logged and monitored for over a decade. We're talking about the obvious places first, mosques, Islamic schools. But the surveillance just ballooned from there. It spread to student associations, places where young people are organizing, debating, getting involved in politics.
And then it moves into just the commercial and social hubs. The places where people are just living their lives. Halal grocery stores, specific cafes, bookstores, even community gyms. The criteria was just terrifyingly broad. If Muslims gathered there, the location was logged, it was categorized, and it was placed under observation.
Yeah, the line between a potential threat and a normal neighborhood corner shop was just completely erased.
Imagine being the owner of a small, family-run halal restaurant. You are now logged as a potential intelligence target. Why? Because of the national origin and religion of your customers, not because you've ever had so much as a parking ticket, let alone committed a crime.
And that shift right there from a place of business to a location of concern, that's the absolute core of the problem.
And that profound shift in method, it's directly tied to the people who are running the show. So who was it? Who was directing this huge, unprecedented municipal intelligence network?
Well, the leadership structure is basically the smoking gun of intent. The program was formally overseen by the police commissioner at the time, Ray Kelly, but the intellectual architect, the operational driver, was a man named David Cohen. And he was brought in directly after serving as the deputy director of the CIA.
Whoa, okay, there it is, the deputy director of the CIA.
Yes.
So when you install a former CIA deputy director at the head of a city police intelligence unit, you are not just getting a new manager, you are literally importing foreign intelligence methodologies. You're taking techniques designed for monitoring hostile states, for foreign espionage, for enemies overseas, and you're applying them directly to domestic policing of U.S. citizens.
And this is a critical legal and philosophical breach. Police work, it operates under the constraints of the Fourth Amendment. It seeks probable cause to enforce existing laws. Foreign intelligence work, it operates under very few constraints. It seeks to manage risk and preempt political events. So when Cohen arrived, the NYPD made a transition. They went from seeking evidence of crimes to preemptively mapping and managing entire demographics.
And as the report put it so concisely, this is the exact moment when citizens become population. Instead of viewing residents as individuals who are guaranteed rights, you reduce them to demographic segments to be monitored and controlled based on some collective identity risk assessment.
And that framing, it instantly legitimizes suspicionless surveillance. Because you aren't watching John Smith anymore, you are monitoring, quote, Pakistani hotspots. It's an intellectual justification that gives you the permission for blanket coverage.
So if they aren't using warrants, if they are bypassing all these legal protocols, how do they actually execute this? This was a massive, decade-long intelligence gathering operation on the ground. What was the actual toolkit for the operatives?
The operation used a multi-layered approach. It leaned very heavily on low-key human intelligence. They used standard plainclothes officers, of course. They used confidential informants. Some were paid. Some were just feeding information to get out of their own immigration or legal trouble. But the key to the whole program's persistence was the creation of this very dedicated role, the Rakers.
The Rakers. I mean, the name itself sounds like something out of a spy novel.
Mm-hmm.
But their work was far more mundane and, frankly, more insidious. They were officers specifically tasked with just blending into community life and generating daily observation. That demands a relentless, almost monotonous level of operational commitment.
Well, think of a Raker's typical day. They weren't kicking down doors. They weren't making arrests. They might spend 5 hours just sitting in a corner booth of a Lebanese cafe near a university, nursing a single coffee. And they're just listening to conversations about exams, local politics, maybe a sermon from last Friday. Their job was not to intervene. It was saturation visibility and passive data collection. They were tasked with collecting the ordinary.
And what actually made it into the logbooks? If they weren't reporting on criminal activity, what were the metrics? What defined success for a raker?
The information they collected was deeply subjective. It focused almost entirely on the atmosphere, the political sentiment, the emotional temperature of the community. The reports actually instructed rakers and informants to record things like specific topics covered in sermons, general political views being expressed, documenting who was present at community meetings, and often just verbatim snippets of conversations they overheard.
But then you get to the most alarming part.
Yeah.
The subjective metrics that turn just ordinary human behavior into an intelligence threat.
Right.
They documented, and this is stated in the internal memos, things like who spoke too loudly,
Yeah.
or who sounded angry.
That is the ultimate bureaucratic absurdity, and it's layered right on top of a constitutional overreach. A heated debate about a soccer game or a genuinely passionate political discussion about city housing policy could be logged internally as evidence of radicalization. Why? Because someone spoke too loudly, It transforms your subjective feelings into a potential threat metric. It means you're being judged not on what you do, but on your tone.
The core operational principle here is really worth repeating. No crime was required to trigger documentation. Just your mere presence in one of these designated locations, or simply expressing a passionate thought, was enough to land you in an NYPD intelligence file. You don't have to violate the law. You just have to exist loudly in the wrong place while having the wrong identity.
And all of that low-level, high-volume data was fed directly into the second pillar of the whole operation, the creation of the identity maps. Internal NYPD investigative findings revealed this extensive ethnic and religious mapping that, again, didn't just cover the 5 boroughs. It spanned across New York State, New Jersey, and Connecticut.
This was a colossal effort of just categorization.
Yeah.
The areas weren't just identified as, Muslim neighborhoods. They were labeled, they were categorized and dissected based on really granular detail. National origin, religious identity, the language spoken, even the presumed political leanings of the local leadership.
And the labels they used internally, they remove all doubt about the demographic targeting. They weren't trying to be discreet. They used titles in their reports that referenced Egyptian locations of concern.
Locations of concern.
Or Pakistani hotspots. And they even explicitly detailed different theological groups, like separating gathering spaces into Sunni mosques and Shia mosques, despite having zero evidence that these distinctions had any relevance at all to criminal activity.
That specific terminology, location of concern or hotspot, it implies a state of heightened risk, right? A state of scrutiny or vulnerability. And that designation was tied exclusively to the national origin and religious identity of the people who gathered there. It's the institutional manifestation of the idea that identity is the lead.
To really appreciate the bias here, we have to contrast these identity maps with traditional police tools. A crime map is reactive. It shows you where robberies or assaults happened, and that helps you deploy police resources to enforce laws.
Right. Data-driven.
An identity map is preemptive, and it is regulatory. It labels locations based on who you are, creating this inherent institutional bias by suggesting that the very existence of a gathering point for a specific demographic group constitutes an area worthy of suspicion and management.
The practical effect on the community must have just been devastating. If you knew, just through word of mouth or the general atmosphere, that your favorite cafe was logged as a hot spot, you start that process of self-correction. You second-guess whether you should even go there, who you should talk to, and what you should say.
That is exactly right. The very mechanism of mapping creates the regulatory framework. If visibility is permanent, then conformity becomes the safest course of action. And that brings us to the actual results of this massive, decade-long enterprise.
So we have detailed this operation that ran for 12 years, from 2002 to 2014. It required immense resources, significant manpower, funding, the continuous effort of these rakers, and a wide network of informants monitoring the daily life of hundreds of thousands of people. So after all that investment, after all that scrutiny, what did this massive intelligence apparatus actually uncover?
The official findings, when they were finally compiled and revealed to the public, presented a dramatic and absolute contradiction to the stated purpose of the program. It was a zero-sum game. After more than a decade of this intensive population-wide surveillance, the reports confirmed 0 terrorism plots were uncovered.
0.
0 actionable leads were generated.
Wow.
And 0 criminal cases ever stemmed from the work of the demographics unit.
That is the single most important and maybe the most ironic data point in this entire deep dive. If the actual goal was demonstrable, measurable counterterrorism success, this was an unmitigated, colossal failure.
But this introduces the most cynical, yet maybe the most profound dirty politics lesson from this whole case. That lack of results, that wasn't a failure. It was potentially the point.
How so?
If your goal is truly to gather intelligence and stop plots, 0 results is failure, period. But if your goal is political and social control, then 0 results, when you combine it with the effect of the surveillance, is highly efficient success.
Okay, I have to push back on that a little bit, because the NYPD and its defenders would argue that the fact that there were 0 plots proves the surveillance was successful. They'd say its mere presence deterred attacks.
Yeah.
How do we dismantle that kind of circular logic?
That is the standard defense, but it lacks any evidence. Deterrence, in a legal sense, it requires visible enforcement. A cop on the corner, you know. This operation wasn't about visible enforcement. It was about pervasive, unseen presence. And we can dismantle that argument by looking at the specific documented outcomes that did occur, which were all internal to the community. Surveillance, in this mode, doesn't always seek arrests. Sometimes it seeks restraint.
And that restraint is achieved through the chilling effect. Talk about those specific documented behavioral changes, because this is the critical mechanism. This is how this dirty politics operation manufactured silence.
The pervasive, suspicionless observation created this climate of, yeah, manufactured silence. The effect on just basic civic and religious life was immediate, and it was measurable. People began actively stopping their own attendance at mosques. They knew the mosque was a labeled location of concern.
Right.
So they reasoned, why make myself visible in a suspect location?
And it wasn't just physical attendance. The whole nature of discussion itself just changed.
Absolutely. People started avoiding any political discussion entirely, even with friends they'd known for years. It was due to this paralyzing uncertainty of who might be listening, who might be an informant, or what level of passion would get logged in a file as angry.
And that's the real cost of permanent visibility. The erosion of trust in the most basic social settings.
You see how it compounds itself?
This environment then created intense pressure on community leaders and parents who started actively discouraging youth activism or any kind of political organizing.
Right. When the cost of speaking up is potentially landing your name in an intelligence file and subjecting your whole family to scrutiny, the message from the older generation becomes, keep your head down, stay quiet. That is control through uncertainty.
And we even saw the mechanism reach all the way into the pulpits. Religious leaders began to radically self-censor their sermons. They started stripping them of any potentially sensitive political content, domestic or international, anything that could be misconstrued, mislogged, or labeled as inflammatory.
The community essentially took on the role of being the state's censor. They adopted this constant self-imposed advisory. They were continuously warning each other to be careful, to watch what you say, and to stay out of the places on the list.
The insidious genius of this type of control is that no explicit orders were ever given by the state. No laws were passed banning attendance at certain places or restricting certain speech. The state simply manufactured permanent uncertainty and guaranteed visibility. And the targeted population performed the regulatory work themselves. Achieving this profound level of social and political compliance.
It's control by atmospheric pressure. The government never had to explicitly restrict a constitutional right like freedom of assembly or speech. They just made exercising those rights inherently risky, and the fear of the unknown consequences, that did the job for them. That is dirty politics at its most modern and its most effective.
So a decade into this covert operation, it finally comes to public light. And the fact that this massive, long-running operation was exposed primarily because of investigative reporting, specifically by the Associated Press, that's really telling about the state of internal oversight.
That single fact that it took persistent external journalism, not internal whistleblowers, not formal oversight committees, and certainly not the city's own elected officials to reveal the program, it just highlights a fundamental systemic failure.
Yeah.
When the only accountability mechanism that actually functions is the press, your checks and balances have failed.
Once it was exposed, the officials running the program, particularly Ray Kelly and his team, they had to scramble to mount a defense. What were the core pillars of their justification for 10 years of suspicionless, demographic-based surveillance?
Their defense was really structured to sound legally and ethically immune. First, they consistently asserted this was lawful intelligence gathering. They argued that intelligence ops fall outside the constraints of traditional criminal law enforcement, and therefore the constitutional constraints like probable cause just don't apply.
Okay. Second, they offered this really strained interpretation of who they were targeting. They claimed they only targeted locations or groups, not individual citizens. The idea being that individual rights were supposedly not violated. It's a semantic dodge.
It is.
It's arguing that observing a building is fine, even if you know exactly which citizens are inside.
And the third defense was the most cynical. It relied entirely on emotional manipulation, not facts. They insisted the program kept New York safe, and they dismissed all critics as being naive or soft on terror with that line, "You can't argue with success."
But that is the crucial point of rebuttal, isn't it?
Yeah.
We just established they generated 0 leads. The expert findings unequivocally stated there was no success to argue with in terms of actual counterterrorism outcomes.
Exactly.
Their defense rested entirely on demanding the public trust a claim of safety, while at the same time suppressing all the evidence that would contradict that claim. It was an argument based on faith, not on operational results.
Precisely. They weaponized the fear of the next attack to defend a program that, by all documented evidence, had done nothing to prevent one.
So fast forward to the legal conclusion. Despite this robust official defense and the appeals to safety, the courts eventually found the NYPD's premise that targeting entire communities based on identity was permissible. They found it untenable. The demographics unit was officially ended in 2014.
The resolution came through a settlement which required two tangible outcomes. First, the NYPD had to formally disband the demographics unit. And second, they had to implement new oversight structures, including a civilian representative, to ensure this didn't happen again. But the ultimate dirty politics lesson here is found in the specific language of the legal agreement.
And what was that language?
The NYPD agreed to the terms and acknowledged the discriminatory impact of the program, meaning they accepted that it unfairly targeted a specific identity group. But they achieved this resolution without admitting any wrongdoing or violation of law.
And there it is. This is the infuriating pattern we see so frequently in these large-scale government misconduct cases. You get reforms without accountability, admissions of harm without consequences. The institution retires the problematic practice, but the individuals who designed and executed the discriminatory policy are completely shielded from any liability or acknowledgement of fault.
The program is corrected in form, but the substance of institutional culpability is never established. And this allows the behavior to be quietly retired without a full legal or political reckoning, which minimizes any potential future liability for the city.
It's a strategic retreat.
It is a strategic retreat to avoid admitting the discriminatory motivation behind the initial policy.
Let's pull back then and connect this NYPD case to the larger series context, because this operation, it really represents a new evolution in the techniques of control.
It absolutely does. When you look at historical dirty politics operations like COINTELPRO, the method was infiltration. They got inside political movements to disrupt them, discredit them, and dismantle them from within.
Right.
The NYPD operation didn't need to infiltrate. It froze movements by creating this external, permanent uncertainty.
And you can compare it to other methods we've analyzed. AstroTurf organizations, they fabricate consent by creating fake grassroots support. This NYPD operation manufactured silence by discouraging any speech in the first place, which makes consent or dissent completely irrelevant.
The critical shift is that the NYPD realized they didn't need the messy, risky work of disruption or infiltration. They just needed the threat of visibility. They achieved their goal of restraint and quietude without having to arrest a single person or pass a single unconstitutional law banning speech.
They simply made presence visible and uncertainty permanent. And in doing so, they achieved political and social control by teaching people not to speak, not to assemble, not to organize, thereby avoiding the effort and risk of active enforcement.
And that brings us to the future, which is the truly provocative implication of this entire case. If the NYPD could create this chilling effect manually, using rakers and paper identity maps in the 2000s, what does this logic look like now in the age of algorithmic surveillance?
The lesson here is about scalability. This logic identity as a lead, presence as suspicion, is designed to scale nationally and become automated. If the subjective judgment of a raker is replaced by some opaque automated risk score that's derived from social media, license plate readers, facial recognition, then the chilling effect becomes instantaneous, invisible, and virtually impossible to challenge.
The problem of being logged for speaking too loudly or for being angry, it doesn't go away. It just disappears behind an algorithm where the reasons for your scrutiny are totally unknowable, yet the resultant restraint on your behavior is absolute. That is the new frontier of dirty politics manufactured by data.
That is a powerful and very uncomfortable thought to leave our listeners with.
It is. The tools change, but the impulse to control populations based on their identity, that remains constant.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.